I remember the sound before the laughter, glasses clinking, the hum of conversation, that low rhythm every veteran event carries. Then Zach's voice cut through sharp, amplified by the microphone. "Captain Grant here handles the real battles, spreadsheets, and staplers." A few people laughed too loudly. Others hesitated, waiting to see if it was a joke they were allowed to enjoy. I stood near the edge of the stage, hands steady around a glass of water. The lights were bright, cold white, washing every expression into one flat mask. My name glowed on the backdrop screen, Michelle Grant, Florida Veterans Outreach. The caption under it read, "Navy Logistics Officer Rhett." He had chosen that slide himself. I caught his father's face in the front row. Captain Roland Butler, retired SEAL, 40 years in the service. His posture was perfect, hands folded, jaw locked. He didn't stop the laughter. He didn't even blink. Zach grinned wider when he saw the crowd respond. I could see the shape of him in that grin, confident, careless, born from a lifetime of being the loudest in any room. The kind of man who believed service meant spotlight, not silence. The applause came next, scattered but cruel, and the camera light blinked red. Live stream, running, thousands watching. I smiled back because anger on camera is weakness, and in our family, weakness was unforgivable. The smell of overcooked steak drifted from the buffet. Someone shouted for a toast. I lifted my glass like everyone else and kept my face still. Inside, a single line replayed calm and exact. "He owes me 6 lives." The room blurred. I could still see Yemen 2017, the fire swallowing the hangar, the radio crackling, Revenant 1 inbound. I was the one inbound. I was the one who landed under small arms fire to pull his team out. The last man on that list was Roland Butler, the same man who now sat still while his son turned service into spectacle. A woman next to me whispered, "He's such a charmer." I nodded politely. My throat burned from silence, not from drink. The host announced the next segment donation awards, and Zach's voice came again. "Give it up for real heroes, the ones who fight, not file." More laughter. My pulse slowed the way it used to before takeoff. Calm isn't the absence of rage, it's the discipline of it. The screen behind him flickered through sponsor logos and finally froze on my photo in uniform. I saw it then, the caption he'd edited. Captain Paperwork. The audience roared. Even the DJ laughed. I felt my grip tighten on the glass until it creaked. The cameraman swung toward me, expecting a reaction. I gave him nothing. I had learned long ago that silence could cut deeper than words. From the stage, Zach flashed a grin that begged approval. His father looked down. My reflection in the glass looked back at me, composed, anonymous. When the applause finally faded, the MC moved on. I placed the glass on the nearest table and walked toward the exit heels, clicking over polished floor. Nobody stopped me. Outside, the air was thick with June heat. Jacksonville at night smelled of salt and gasoline. In the distance, I could hear the faint echo of music from the Civic Center ballroom. I took a breath, steady and deliberate the way I used to before every flight. This wasn't the first time they'd mistaken quiet for weakness, but it would be the last. I pulled my phone from my bag. Notifications were already flooding in, tags, mentioned snippets of laughter. One headline on the live feed read, "Paper Captain Goes Viral." I stared at it for a long moment. Then I turned off the screen and slipped the phone back into my bag. A security guard at the gate glanced up as I passed. "Good night, ma'am." "Not yet," I said softly. On the drive back to Pensacola, the road unrolled under the headlights like a landing strip. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. I rolled down the window. The air was hot, the kind that sticks to your skin in memory. The silence was loud enough to hear my own heartbeat. I thought about Roland's face, about the medal ceremony he once said wasn't necessary, about Zach and that easy confidence built on borrowed valor. And I thought about the one thing I had never used proof. The next time they laughed, I wouldn't stay quiet. I wouldn't raise my voice either. I'd let the truth do it for me. The morning after the gala, my phone lit up before sunrise. A notification from the Veterans Outreach group chat flashed on the screen. Someone had posted a link with the caption, "You gotta see this." I clicked. There I was frozen mid-smile in a viral clip from last night's live stream. The camera had zoomed in right after Zach called me captain of spreadsheets and staplers. The crowd laughed. My face did not. The video had over 1.8 million views in 8 hours. Hashtags scrolled across the comments like shrapnel. Paper captain. Office hero. Admin warrior. People who had never served were mocking what they did not understand. A few veterans defended me in the thread. Most just watched. I stared at the screen until the sunlight hit the blinds. My reflection looked like a ghost inside the phone. Then the call came. Roland. His voice still carried command even through static. He said I should let it go. He said Zach was young, that the internet forgot fast, that family came before pride. I listened. Then I asked one question. When they laughed at me, did you laugh too? He went quiet. The silence told me everything I needed. The next call came from Eleanor. She did not call me Michelle. She called me dear the way someone uses tone as a leash. She said, families forgive. Do not ruin his career. She said the Butlers have always handled things privately. I said, maybe that is the problem. She asked me to delete my comment defending myself under the viral clip. I told her I had already done it once 7 years ago in Yemen when I kept my mouth shut so her husband could keep his metal clean. She did not answer. Then she hung up. By noon, I was the face of a joke no one wanted to stop telling. The Jacksonville Daily Sun ran an online headline, "Paper Captain Handles, PR Crisis Like a Pro." They used my photo from the gala cropped tight on the smile that was never real. I went to the office anyway. The veterans who worked under me avoided eye contact. One of them left coffee on my desk with a Post-it that said, "Hang in there, ma'am." I appreciated it more than I let him know. At lunch, my assistant forwarded an email. A major sponsor had withdrawn from the Women's Logistics program I had founded. The reason read pending internal review due to reputational concerns. I sat there in the fluorescent light, the taste of bitterness, sharp as metal. When the phone rang again, I almost ignored it. The caller ID read private. The voice on the line was flat and genderless. He is lying about serving. Then the line cut. I stared at the phone, the words echoing. It took me 30 seconds to open my laptop. My fingers typed the address before I even realized it. va.gov. Verify military record. Zach Butler, date of birth 1989. Florida. The cursor blinked while the system searched. Result not found. I refreshed. Same. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling tiles. The hum of the air conditioner felt louder than my heartbeat. I thought of Roland's words. He's young, don't overreact. Young men forge their own myths when old men hand them the hammer. I closed the laptop and poured a glass of water that tasted like dust. That night, I watched the gala clip again. The angle caught Roland sitting still while the audience laughed. His face looked carved from habit. He had not even flinched. The man I had once carried out of a burning compound in Yemen had chosen decorum over decency. I remembered the moment like a scar. The explosion behind the fuel tanks, the smell of jet fuel, the scream on the radio, Revenant 1 inbound, hold line. I had carried him 300 meters through sand so hot it melted the soles of my boots. He never told anyone who saved him. I told myself it was humility. Maybe it was shame. At 2 a.m, I opened the laptop again. I drafted an email to myself with the subject line proof. I attached a screenshot of the verification result, the sponsor's withdrawal notice, and a copy of the live stream clip. Then I wrote a note to remember how it felt. When they make you invisible, you make them transparent. I fell asleep in the chair. The next morning, a new post appeared. A local news page captioned it with "Humor runs in the Butler family." The clip showed Roland at breakfast reporters asking about the gala. He smiled and said Zach meant no harm. The internet laughed again. My silence had bought them another day of comfort. I opened my inbox. A new message had arrived from an address I did not recognize. Subject line: from a friend who remembers Yemen. Inside was a single line. They scrubbed your name from the report. Operation Revenant, page 32. My hand trembled. I logged into the classified archive with the credentials I had kept from my last assignment. The report loaded slow, like it knew what it was hiding. On page 32, under the section marked Rescue Coordination, the entry read, Extraction completed by Naval Command. No mention of me. No mention of the 6 men who had walked out alive because of a logistician who refused to run. I printed the page. The paper felt heavier than truth. By dusk, I had decided. If they wanted to test how long I could stay quiet, they were about to find out the limit. The next time they laughed, I would not defend myself. I would let the records do it for me. Have you ever been told to keep peace when what they meant was keep quiet? Leave a comment if that ever happened to you. The file that spoke. I opened the VA portal again before the office lights flicked on the kind of quiet hour when even a keyboard sounds like it has an echo. The verification page waited like a locked door. I entered his name, his date of birth, the state he always bragged about. Search. The cursor spun and then settled into a single line that felt colder than any insult. Record not found. I tried another query, cross-checked the Social Security digits I knew from a tax form he once asked me to review. Record not found. I tried the discharge document field as a test. DD 214 unavailable. The system did not care about charm or followers or a smile that looked good on camera. It returned the same answer every time. Nothing. I reached for a pen and wrote the result in my notebook because ink makes a moment permanent. Then I wrote the date, July 2024, and underlined it. Proof lives in details. The sun came up slow over Pensacola, a pale band on the edge of the blinds. I sat back and closed my eyes, and the present fell away like a curtain. I was back in Yemen in 2017 at a forward operating site outside Aden, where heat carried the taste of metal. The night had cracked open with a sound that still lived in my bones. Fuel tanks, then fire, then the radio filling with voices. Revenant 1 inbound. Hold line. I do not remember thinking. I remember counting. Distance to the compound. Time to impact. The weight of a decision you never write into a report. I ran the numbers, moved assets, diverted the bird, and cleared the sand strip with a crew that trusted me more than the map. When the rotors cut the smoke, we were already moving. I saw the team through the fire like shadows tearing themselves free. The last man into the craft stumbled. He looked straight at me and shouted a name over the noise. Grant! Then the blast wave took the rest of the words away. He was Captain Roland Butler, and he kept his eyes on mine until the door slammed. Later, under a canvas roof that flapped like a severed wing, I signed the preliminary report. I wrote the coordinates and the timings and the standard phrase about coordination by Naval Command. My rank required precision and humility. It did not require erasure. Months later, when the final report was filed in Washington, someone made sure my name was not there. Extraction completed by Naval Command. A clean line for a messy night. It traveled well in briefings and ceremonies. It left no blood on anyone's hands. I kept my mouth shut because I believed there was honor in letting the work speak. I learned that silence speaks a language that other people translate for their comfort. Back at my desk, I pulled the archived file again. Operation Revenant. The entries were familiar clinical words lined up like soldiers. On page 32, the section called Rescue Coordination sat under a header that meant nothing. No call sign, no pilot code, no radio transcript, just a sentence that gave the credit to a building. I printed the page and slid it into a manila folder as if paper had weight, heavy enough to anchor truth. Then I wrote a single sentence on a sticky note and pressed it to the margin. Truth does not need rank. I had never written that out loud. Seeing it in my handwriting felt like drawing a boundary with ink. Around 10, an email arrived from an address that looked like a burner. No signature, no greeting. They scrubbed your name. See the addendum filed by Butler. The attached file was a scan of an authorization note. I recognized the signature even before the name rendered: Roland A. Butler. Captain Seal retired. He had certified the final language of the report for a historical record, the same record that would one day decide who gets invited to a podium and who gets seated near the exit. The justification line said to maintain team cohesion and clarity of command. It read like duty and felt like betrayal. I walked to the break room and ran water over my wrists until the cold steadied my pulse. I thought about the way he sat at the gala, hands folded, eyes forward, watching his son turn my work into a punchline. I thought about the years I had given to a uniform I loved so much I let it take the credit it never asked for. I dried my hands, went back to my desk, and opened a new email draft addressed to myself. Subject proof again. I attached the VA screenshots, the report pages, the signature file. Then I opened a clean document and began to write what happened in Yemen in one page of simple sentences, the way you speak to a judge who only cares about facts. Operations live or die on logistics. A runway cleared 10 seconds earlier can erase a funeral. A correct fuel mix can turn a last stand into a landing. People who call us office soldiers never stay to count who made it home. At noon, my assistant knocked with lunch I had not ordered and left without a word. I ate one forkful and pushed the rest away. The screensaver on the TV in the lobby rotated to a local news segment. The headline read, "Paper Captain Faces Backlash Online." They used a still of me from the gala, the same half smile framed by laughter and a clip of Zach flexing near the sponsor wall. The anchor leaned into the camera and used the word controversy like it was a game. I muted the sound and watched the closed captions crawl. When the segment ended, I went back to the VA portal and ran the search again, even though I knew the result would not change. It felt like checking a pulse you already knew had stopped. Record not found. I took a breath and asked myself what would change the next time someone asked me to take the high road. The truth is not a hill, it is a compass. In the afternoon, a message appeared in my inbox from Florida Journal of Ethics. It was a form letter. "We review all submissions in the order received. You may be contacted for verification." I did not reply. Instead, I drafted the tip I wanted them to hear as if I were standing on a witness stand. Statement. A public figure, Zachary Butler of Jacksonville, has solicited funds using the implication of military service. VA records show no service. Documentation attached. Secondary statement. A retired SEAL captain filed language that removed an officer from recognition in a rescue account following a 2017 operation. Documentation attached. I paused before I sent it. I was not hunting a man. I was hunting a lie. When I pressed send, nothing happened. No flash, no sound. Just a small whoosh and the knowledge that a door had opened somewhere I could not see. I printed another copy of the operation page and read it again until the words blurred. Rescue by Naval Command. It sounds clean, said out loud. It also hides 100 choices someone made in the dark. I imagined the exact moment the pen met the paper in Washington, the weight of the signature that decided who would be visible. I wanted to be angry with Roland. Instead, I felt something closer to grief, like watching a bridge you once trusted begin to crumble. By evening, the sky over the bay turned the color of old brass. I took the folder home and placed it on my kitchen table. The house was quiet enough to hear the tick inside the wall clock. I boiled water for coffee I did not need just to give my hands a task. Then I opened the folder again and wrote the questions a reporter would ask me if this ever made it to daylight. Did you ever ask for a medal? Did you ever ask for recognition? No. What do you want now? I want accuracy. I want a boy who thinks punching a keyboard is not a fight to learn what it means to carry weight he cannot see. I want a man who once looked me in the eye while smoke ate the sky to do the same thing now without a fire to force him. Near midnight, I received one more email from the burner address. One line again. If you want them to listen, make the file speak. I looked at the folder at the pages that had already spoken to me all day. Then I opened a new message without a sender name attached every document and addressed it to the intake line at Florida Journal of Ethics. I added a subject that told the whole story without a single adjective: false service claim and altered rescue attribution. I hovered over send for one breath and pressed the key. The screen returned to the inbox. No victory music, no heat, just the steady hum of the refrigerator and the slow beat of my heart. Somewhere in Jacksonville, a man was sleeping like a person who believed he could not be touched. Somewhere in Pensacola, a retired captain had placed his coin beside his watch and told himself that history is complicated. In my kitchen, the file waited. The same words, the same signatures, the same proof. The next time they asked for silence, the file would answer for me. The headline hit the feed like a detonation: "Fitness influencer under fire for false veteran claims." I read it twice, then again out loud, as if saying it could make it real. The article quoted an anonymous tip that matched the exact phrasing I had sent to the Florida Journal of Ethics. They had done their homework. Screenshots of the VA record were attached. The piece ended with a line that tasted like justice. When asked for comment, the Veterans Affairs Office confirmed no record of service for Zachary Butler. I watched the view count climb in real time: 20,000, then 50, then 100. I did not smile. Vindication never feels like victory when it comes too easy. At noon, Zach went live. I watched from my laptop the screen split between his feed and the comment thread that scrolled faster than rain on glass. His voice was steady in that practiced influencer tone, casual enough to sound honest. He said the story was fake news. He said people were jealous. Then he said the word aunt. My aunt's just bitter that no one remembers her. The room behind him was bright gym posters, a ring light reflection in his eyes. He laughed. The audience laughed with him. A few comments asked for proof of his service. He ignored them. The stream ended with him smirking and saying, "No one can touch me." I closed the laptop so hard the sound startled me. Within minutes, my phone buzzed with a message from Eleanor. "Stop this. You are tearing the family apart." I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I typed back one sentence. Maybe the family needed breaking. I put the phone down before I could see her reply. The sky outside was heavy with thunderclouds that refused to rain. The smell of salt drifted in through the window. I thought of the desert again, of the radio call that had saved 6 men. Revenant 1 inbound. Hold line. The phrase echoed like an unfinished promise. I walked to the closet and pulled down a small black case marked with the seal of Naval Command. Inside were 2 drives. One was empty, the one I used for work. The other had not been opened since I left the service. The label read SEAL Comms Archive 2017. My handwriting was faint. I plugged it in. The drive spun like it was waking up after years of silence. A list of files appeared, each marked by time and frequency. I scrolled until I found the one that still made my hands shake. Mission Revenant. Radio log full. I pressed play. Static first, then voices. A man yelling coordinates, then another voice, calm, steady, precise. Mine. Command copies. Adjust 2 clicks south. Hold line. Revenant 1 inbound. The background roared with fire and wind, then the sound of metal hitting ground and a voice that would never leave me. Butler down. I listened as my own voice counted distance and timing, and then the thud that meant the bird had landed. I remembered every second of that night. The final minute was quiet except for the rotors fading and someone breathing hard. Then the words I had never forgotten. Extraction complete, all accounted for. God bless logistics. Laughter followed, ragged and relieved. Then someone said, "Her name's Grant, right," and the recording cut. I sat back in the chair and felt the tears sting but not fall. The drive still worked. The truth still had a pulse. I made a copy and labeled it Revenant Log Proof. I placed the original back in the case and locked it. The next morning, the news cycle exploded again. Local station WJXT ran a segment on the controversy. They used the same phrase as the article, but sharper. Fake vet scandal rocks Veterans Fund Gala host. Zach's publicist released a statement claiming clerical error. Roland was quoted saying family matters were private. I watched the clip over breakfast spoon frozen mid-air. Every lie felt rehearsed. Every denial sounded practiced. I wondered if they practiced this together. By noon, my inbox was a battlefield. Some emails were supportive. Others accused me of betrayal. A few called me unpatriotic. One subject line said Judas in uniform. I deleted it without reading. Around 3 in the afternoon, a knock came at my door. It was my neighbor, a retired Marine named Tom, who ran a bait shop down the street. He held a folded newspaper. He said quietly, "I know the look of a truth that hurts the right people." Then he handed me the paper and left. The article had been picked up by national media now. My email had reached beyond Florida. I poured coffee I would not drink and watched the comments multiply. One thread stood out. Someone wrote, "If the report was fake, where's the proof?" I opened the folder on my desktop. The audio file sat there like a sleeping animal. I played 10 seconds, just enough to hear the line that mattered. Revenant 1 inbound. Hold line. I stopped it before I could hear my own voice again. The timestamp matched the mission report exactly. That was the key. I opened a blank document and began drafting a second anonymous submission. Statement attached is radio log from Operation Revenant 2017 confirming field coordination by then Lieutenant Michelle Grant. Confirmation available through classified timestamp metadata. The recording speaks for itself. I saved it but did not send it. Not yet. It had to hurt more first. That night, Zach went live again. He joked about internet detectives and jealous relatives. He called the story boring. He said he would be back with proof soon. The comments exploded with laughing emojis. He did not know that every word was being downloaded and archived by the same people he mocked. When the stream ended, he smiled and said softly, "No one can touch me." I paused the video on that frame. His eyes half closed, the kind of smirk that came from never being held accountable. I whispered to the empty room, "You are not ready for round 2. I turned off the screen and opened the window. The rain had finally started. It hit the sill with a rhythm that felt like punctuation. Somewhere between thunder and silence, I remembered the feel of sand against my palms when I dragged Roland to safety years ago. I had thought survival was enough. I had thought truth would wait. Now I knew it had a schedule of its own. I sat down and began outlining the next move. The recording was the first weapon. The paper trail was the second. The rest would come when the world stopped laughing. I sent one message to the Florida Journal with no attachments, just a sentence. "There is more. You will want to hear it." Then I shut the laptop and let the rain cover the sound of my heartbeat. Ever watched a liar call truth fake news? Smash that like for justice. The fallout arrived slower than the headlines, but heavier than any blast. By early September, sponsors began backing out one after another. The official line was under review. The unofficial one was fear. Zach's gym partnership lost 2 deals in 48 hours. His once polished Instagram grid turned into a battlefield of comments accusing him of stolen valor. The morning shows picked up the story using phrases like influencer scandal and veterans outraged. I watched without satisfaction. Justice never looks clean when it involves family. At the outreach office, the board chair asked if I wanted to release a statement. I said no. Silence was the statement now. Around noon, the receptionist buzzed. "Captain Butler to see you." My first instinct was to hang up. My second was curiosity. When he walked in, Roland looked smaller than I remembered, as if the years had finally caught up. His uniform jacket was gone, replaced by a plain shirt, tucked too neatly, a man trying to hold his shape. In his right hand, he held a seal coin, the same one I had seen him spin between his fingers during deployments when he was thinking through strategy. He placed it on my desk. The metal gleamed dull gold under the office lights. He did not sit. He said, "You saved me." I never said it. I looked at him for a long time before I answered, "And you let them laugh." His jaw tightened. He said he thought silence would protect everyone. I said it only protected lies. His eyes dropped to the coin. He turned it once the edges pressing into his skin. I could see the tremor in his hand. Years of control undone by truth he could no longer command. He said I didn't know he was lying. I believed him the first time. Then I remembered the signature on the report and believed him less. He said, "I'll fix it." I said, "Truth fixes itself, Captain, but sometimes it takes a storm." He finally sat shoulders bent, his voice low enough that I had to lean in. He said he had watched the gala clip more times than he could count. He said he saw his son's face and mine and wondered when pride had become blindness. I told him blindness begins the moment someone calls silence loyalty. The door opened before he could answer. Eleanor stepped in like she owned the air in the room. Her perfume arrived first sharp and floral. She looked at me, then at the coin. "Enough old wounds," she said. "You're making him sick." I said, "Truth isn't poison. Lies are." She bristled. "He doesn't need your judgment. I said he needed honesty 20 years ago." The room went quiet. Roland's hand still held the coin knuckles white. For a moment I thought he might say something that would change everything. Instead, he closed his hand and nodded toward Eleanor. "Let's go." She turned satisfied as if the argument had been won. They left together, but Roland hesitated at the door. He looked back once, eyes meeting mine. For the first time, he did not look like a commander. He looked like a man caught between duty and regret. After they left, I sat for a while staring at the coin's imprint on the desk, a small circle of oil and dust where his hand had been. I wiped it away and pulled a folder from the drawer labeled Déclasse Orders. Inside was the official notice for Operation Revenant, stamped for public release. I had requested it months ago under the Freedom of Information Act, half believing it would never come. The letter confirmed declassification effective August 2024. The operation's details were now accessible for public record. I printed a copy of the page that mentioned extraction coordination and placed it beside the original report that had erased me. 2 pages, same date, one lie undone by time. I imagined Roland's face when he saw it. I imagined Zach's silence when the reporters asked about it. The next day, the fallout deepened. A federal inquiry had been opened into the Heroes Rebuilt Fund. The IRS press release cited irregularities in disbursements and documentation. I knew Monroe from my past audit work at the VA. He left a message saying he wanted to talk. I deleted it for now. The internet had already judged Zach guilty. The law would take longer, but it always arrived. That night I went to a small cafe near the bay, the kind with no music and strong coffee. The window fogged with humidity, and the quiet felt earned. I watched ships docked in the distance and thought about how many people mistake survival for peace. The bell above the door rang. Roland stepped in again, alone this time. He ordered nothing, just walked to my table. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes. He placed the coin back on the table. He said, "I want you to keep it." I said, "I don't need souvenirs." He said, "It's not that. It's a reminder." I asked, "Of what?" He said, "Of what we owe each other when the noise fades." He sat for a moment longer, staring at the bay. He said, "Eleanor doesn't understand. She thinks honor is a decoration, not a debt." I said, "Honor without truth is just theater." He nodded. I pulled out the D-class order and slid it across the table. His eyes scanned the header. His lips parted when he saw the date. He whispered so they released it. I said yes. He asked what I planned to do. I said nothing yet. The truth doesn't need my help anymore. He nodded again, pushed the coin toward me, and stood. His hand lingered on the chair back like he was anchoring himself. Then he said, "Thank you, Captain," and walked out into the night. I watched him disappear through the rain-slick glass until only his reflection remained. When I looked down, the coin caught the light again, the emblem worn but still clear. I turned it over and read the inscription engraved on the edge. Brotherhood in silence. I whispered to no one in particular, "Not anymore." Have you ever seen truth make the room go quiet? Leave a comment if you know that feeling. By October, the story had stopped being gossip and started being evidence. The Florida Journal had published a follow-up citing financial discrepancies in the Heroes Rebuilt Fund. I read the piece twice before calling the one person I trusted with numbers. Agent Monroe, Internal Revenue Service Fraud Division. I had worked with him years ago when I was auditing supply chain contracts for the Navy. His voice over the phone was dry as paper. He said he could look into it, but needed access. I said I had receipts, both digital and moral. We met at a quiet federal annex building near downtown Pensacola. The air smelled of coffee and printer ink. Monroe was tall gray at the temples with a habit of tapping his pen against his folder when he was close to an idea. He slid a form across the table. I signed. He asked if I was ready to see where the money went. I said I had been ready for 7 years. The file he opened showed transfers disguised as vendor reimbursements, small enough to hide inside the noise of legitimate donations. But the total was not small. $187,000 moved into accounts tied to a gym renovation, new equipment, and a car registered to Zach Butler. Monroe leaned back, whistling low. He said, "That's a lot of treadmills for a charity." I said, "It's also a lot of betrayal for a family." He looked at me over his glasses. "He's blood, you sure you want to keep going?" I said he stopped being family when he wore lies as uniform. Monroe nodded and closed the folder. Then he said something I still remember. "Paper trails don't lie, Captain. People do. We agreed on a process. I would act as confidential informant. He would file a preliminary audit under the Federal Charity Compliance Code. It would take time, but once the system started moving, it would not stop. The next morning, I woke to messages I didn't expect. My program's funding was officially frozen pending review. Someone had reported a conflict of interest. I didn't need to guess who. By noon, the story had turned again. Zach's publicist released a statement accusing me of waging a personal vendetta. The spin was almost elegant. I was no longer a whistleblower. I was a jealous aunt with an agenda. I turned off my phone and opened my laptop. Monroe had sent me the first trace summary transaction chains, Shell donors' payment logs, proof stacked in neat lines. He said the case was under federal seal for now. I printed the summary and placed it inside the same folder as the Revenant files. 2 wars, 2 different fronts, same enemy fabrication. That evening, as the sun bled into the bay, someone knocked on my door. When I opened it, Roland stood there holding a letter. His expression carried the kind of exhaustion you only get from guilt that won't let you sleep. He handed me the envelope. It was a subpoena. He had been called as a witness in the Heroes Rebuilt investigation. His eyes searched mine for something, mercy maybe, or understanding. I said, "The truth comes with paperwork." He tried to smile. It didn't work. He said, "They're calling me because I vouched for him." I said, "Then vouch for the truth this time." He nodded barely. I could see the outline of the coin in his pocket pressing against the fabric. He said, "Eleanor doesn't want me to testify." I said, "Eleanor likes polished stories." He said, "She's scared." I said, "She should be." When he left, the night air carried the faint sound of waves breaking against the seawall. I stood there until I felt the anger cool enough to handle. The next day, Eleanor called. Her voice was soft, deliberate, the way people sound when they've rehearsed guilt. She said, "Please, Michelle, this has gone far enough. You're destroying him." I said, "No, he did that himself." She said, "He's your blood." I said, "Blood is chemistry, integrity is choice." She said, "What do you even want?" I said, "Accuracy." She said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I already have." Then I ended the call. I opened my laptop, pulled up Monroe's secure folder, and uploaded the last piece of evidence, the transfer logs, from the charity's vendor account. The system confirmed receipt. I stared at the progress bar, the slow crawl of digital justice. When it finished, I whispered, "This is me serving again." The next week felt like waiting for a storm you knew would hit. News outlets began circling the story like sharks. Leaked documents appeared online. Anonymous sources claimed internal mismanagement. The name Heroes Rebuilt became ironic overnight. I avoided interviews and focused on what I could control. The outreach office still needed running veterans, still needed help with forms, housing, and quiet moments of dignity. Life didn't stop just because truth had finally woken up. Monroe called me 2 days before the audit went public. His tone was different now, sharper. He said, "We've got enough to move forward. The U.S. attorney wants to see the file." I asked if he thought it would stick. He said, "It's numbers and names. It always sticks." The morning the investigation became official, I stood by my window watching the bay. The news ticker scrolled across the bottom of the screen. IRS launches investigation into Heroes Rebuilt Fund. Founder denies wrongdoing. I could see the reflection of my own face in the glass, calm but older. Justice doesn't make you young again. It just makes you lighter. That afternoon, I received another letter. This one wasn't from the court. It was handwritten blue ink folded carefully. Eleanor's handwriting. She asked me to reconsider to withdraw my cooperation. She said, "Families survive because someone decides to stop." I folded the letter back and slipped it between the pages of the Revenant report. Some things needed to stay as evidence. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and read Monroe's final message. He said, "You did good, Captain." I wrote back, "It's not over." He replied, "It never is." I looked out the window again, the bay reflecting late light. For the first time in months, the horizon looked clear. Have you ever had to choose between family and truth? Tell me in the comments which one you'd choose. The morning of November 10th began with a sound I would never forget, the crisp click of a news anchor's voice breaking through silence. The television in the outreach lounge flashed the familiar WJXT Jacksonville banner. Hero Fund under IRS review. The crawl beneath it read, "Founder Zach Butler taken into custody pending investigation of misused veteran donations." The image that filled the screen froze me mid-breath. Zach in handcuffs, head down, face pale but still defiant, surrounded by reporters shouting his name. Cameras flashed against the morning glare as 2 agents guided him toward a waiting car. Behind him, the Heroes Rebuilt banner flapped weakly in the wind, half torn, half proud. I didn't move. My coffee went cold beside the stack of paperwork. The anchor continued with that perfectly even tone that made every tragedy sound digestible. The story described allegations of financial misconduct, inflated service claims, and misrepresented military credentials. They replayed a clip from one of Zach's old videos where he called himself a veteran of the fight for resilience. The irony hung in the air. Then came the next frame, Eleanor outside their home crying into a camera. Her hair was perfect, her makeup smudged just enough to seem real. She said through trembling lips, "He's a good boy. He only wanted to help people." Reporters nodded, pretending sympathy. Roland stood behind her, half in shadow, refusing to meet the lens. When the segment ended, the camera returned to the anchor, her professional empathy polished to perfection. I reached for the remote and turned the screen off. The sudden quiet filled the room like a weight. I sat for a moment watching my reflection in the dark glass. No smile, no satisfaction, just stillness. The phone buzzed once, a message from Roland. "He'll face court." I typed back before I could stop myself. So did I in silence. He didn't reply. That night, social media burned hotter than any wildfire. Hero Fund trended nationwide. Comment sections turned into battlefields. Some called it justice. Others called it jealousy. Veterans from around the country began sharing their own stories of false heroes and stolen valor. The noise was deafening. I logged out. There was nothing to add. Around midnight, the doorbell rang. It was Monroe. His tie was loose, his eyes tired but satisfied. He said, "It's official." The charges stuck. Embezzlement, wire fraud, falsified credentials. Bail hearing in 2 days. I asked if he felt anything after all that digging. He said, "Relief. Numbers don't lie, but they always take their time." He handed me a copy of the public affidavit. I skimmed the pages' lines of black ink detailing how every dollar meant for veterans rehab had been rerouted to luxury upgrades, influencer partnerships, and a personal savings account under an alias. It was clean, cold justice, the kind that doesn't apologize. Monroe looked at me and said, "You look calm." I said, "Calm isn't peace. It's exhaustion." He nodded and left. I stood by the window, the city lights shimmering against the bay. Somewhere out there, cameras still flashed in Zach's face. Somewhere, Eleanor was rewriting her version of grace. Somewhere, Roland was sitting alone, his silence too loud to escape. The next morning, every newspaper carried the same headline: Hero Fund Fraud Exposed. The image of Zach in cuffs spread across front pages from Miami to Seattle. Beneath it, a smaller photo showed Roland, face half hidden, watching his son being led away. The caption read, "Retired SEAL declines comment." I made myself read every line not out of cruelty, but because truth deserves witnesses. At lunch, one of my outreach volunteers stopped by my office. She was young, barely 25, a Navy vet like I once was, still figuring out where strength begins and pride ends. She asked, "Does it ever stop hurting?" I said, "Only when you stop pretending it didn't happen." She nodded and left. That night, the local evening news aired a longer feature. They played the audio of Zach's last live stream before his arrest. His voice cracked between anger and denial. He said, "This is all fake." My aunt set me up. She hates me because I made something of myself. The crowd in the chat cheered and cursed in equal measure. When the feed cut, the anchor summarized the situation with polished detachment. I didn't watch the rest. The remote was within reach again, and I pressed power. Darkness returned, blessed and heavy. An hour later, another message came, this time from an unknown number. "You did this. He's your blood." I deleted it without reading twice. The world was reacting exactly how it always does, loud, self-righteous, blind to nuance. I poured another cup of coffee and opened my laptop. The email from the Veterans Administration confirmed the suspension of Heroes Rebuilt's nonprofit status. The irony was sharp. The man who mocked me for pushing paper had just been undone by paperwork. I wrote the words down in my notebook. Paper never forgets. The next few days blurred into one long stream of hearing statements and phone calls. Reporters reached out to me for comments. I said nothing. Roland tried calling twice. I didn't pick up. On the third attempt, he left a voicemail. His voice was rough, weary. He said I was wrong. I thought silence would spare him. "I see now it only buried you." He paused, then added, "I'll testify." The line clicked dead. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to compassion, not for Zach, but for the man who had finally found his voice. Outside, the wind shifted from the ocean, cool and deliberate. I stood on the porch, the salt air catching in my throat. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a siren somewhere downtown. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle. The next morning, when I checked my phone, Monroe had sent one final message. "Case forwarded to federal court. You started this." I typed back, "I just finished it." Then I closed the laptop, poured my coffee, and sat by the window. The bay was calm, pale gold in the morning light. Justice didn't look dramatic. It looked like peace disguised as paperwork. Would you forgive a family who dragged your name through the mud? Or would you let silence speak for you? The courtroom in downtown Jacksonville smelled like old wood and restraint. It was the second week of January 2025, the air outside sharp and clean, the kind that made every sound echo longer. The case had moved faster than anyone expected. The headlines had already softened from scandal to consequence. People were no longer angry. They were watching, waiting for closure. When I entered, I saw Roland seated at the witness stand, hands folded, eyes fixed on the judge. He looked smaller, but not weaker. Age had carved lines into his face that discipline could no longer hide. Across the room, Eleanor sat stiffly, her pearl earrings catching the courtroom light. She avoided looking at me, but I could feel her disapproval radiating like heat. The prosecutor asked Roland to confirm his identity and his history of service. He did so without hesitation. Then came the question that would strip the last layer of denial away. Did you sign a document verifying your son's service record, knowing it was false? Roland inhaled slowly. The pause stretched long enough for everyone in the room to lean forward. "Yes," he said finally. "I did." The sound of pen scratching filled the silence that followed. The prosecutor nodded. "Why?" he said. "Because he's my son, and I thought I was protecting him." His voice cracked at the edges, but he did not lower his head. The prosecutor pressed further. "And do you understand the legal implications of falsifying a federal record?" "I do," he said. Then the prosecutor asked one more question. "Do you regret it?" Roland's eyes flicked toward Eleanor, then to me. He said, "I regret not telling the truth sooner." Eleanor's sharp intake of breath was audible even from my seat. She whispered, "You'll destroy us." He turned toward her, voice steady. "We already did years ago." The courtroom went completely silent. Even the judge paused before continuing. The rest of the testimony unfolded like slow confession. Roland admitted that years ago, after my mission in Yemen, he'd been approached by a public affairs officer who wanted to rewrite the after-action report to make the chain of command look cleaner. The credit had been shifted upward, the field names erased. He had signed the amended report believing it was just paperwork, but that signature had erased my contribution and laid the groundwork for his son's lie years later. When the prosecutor asked if he had recognized my call sign when Zach started using military references for his charity, he said yes. "Then why didn't you stop him?" He said, "Because I was afraid of reopening what I'd already buried." The judge thanked him and dismissed the witness. Roland stepped down slowly, every motion deliberate. Eleanor refused to meet his eyes. I did. For the first time in years, I saw the man who had once led missions through fire, now stripped to his core, not by war, but by truth. After court adjourned, the crowd filtered out in whispers. I waited by the corridor until I saw him emerge. His shoulders were squared, but his expression was hollow. He approached me without a word, stopping a few feet away. The hallway light caught the faint sheen of sweat on his temple. He said, "I'll make it right." I said, "Not for me, for truth." He nodded the smallest motion, but it felt heavier than any salute. We walked outside together into the winter light. The courthouse steps faced the bay, the water silver under a pale sky. He looked out at it for a long time. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of gulls and distant traffic. He said, "You ever think silence could feel like comfort again?" I said, "Only when it stops costing people their names." He gave a short, almost bitter laugh. "You always were better at seeing straight lines." I said, "You taught me to measure first." He smiled faintly at that, then grew quiet again. I could see the guilt still living behind his eyes, not loud, just constant. He said, "Eleanor doesn't understand. She thinks loyalty means covering pain." I said, "Loyalty means cleaning it up." He exhaled a long breath that seemed to take years with it. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It was a personal statement he planned to submit to the judge before sentencing. In it, he took full responsibility for the falsified record and acknowledged the harm caused to every veteran whose name had been overshadowed by his silence. I read it once and handed it back. He said, "Keep it." I said, "No. You need to say it out loud." He nodded. "I'll do that." We stood there until the wind grew colder. The sun was low, turning the water into streaks of gold. He said, "You know, when I first met you, you were 25, sitting in a cockpit telling an admiral you didn't need permission to do what was right." I said, "Some habits die slow." He smiled again, then turned toward the courthouse door. As he reached the steps, he looked back one last time. "Thank you, Captain." I said, "You're welcome, Commander." He disappeared inside. I stayed by the railing, watching the tide shift. Somewhere in that slow rhythm, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not relief, just the quiet settling of balance restored. My phone buzzed with a message from Monroe. He said he did it, testified full and clean. I replied, I know. The light over the bay softened into evening. Somewhere behind me, the courthouse doors closed with a final hollow echo. Have you ever watched someone finally tell the truth after years of silence? Tell me what you'd do in their place. May 2025 arrived with the kind of sunlight that makes Washington look almost honest. The National Veterans Honor Conference was held inside the Grand Hall of the Capitol Marriott, a room so polished it could have been carved out of reflection itself. Rows of uniforms and medals filled the seats. Every stripe and ribbon told a story, every silence a cost. I had been invited as part of the outreach delegation. I almost didn't come. Roland was on the program as keynote speaker. I didn't know until I saw his name printed beside the words, Retired SEAL Captain Honorary Presenter. The irony felt surgical. As I waited backstage, I could hear the rustle of applause from the previous segment. Then the announcer's voice filled the room. Please welcome Captain Roland Butler, recipient of the Navy Cross, to present this year's Distinguished Service Citation. The sound rose, then fell into the soft hum of respect. When he stepped onto the stage, his posture was the same as it had been years ago, steady and deliberate. But something was different. His face had lost its armor. He didn't start with a speech. He started with a confession. Honor isn't inherited, he said. It's earned. The words hung in the air like a slow drumbeat. He let the silence sit before continuing. Years ago, my team survived a mission that should have ended us. We came home alive because of a pilot whose name never made it into the report. She saved 6 men that night. She saved me. He paused, voice steady, but eyes shining. I should have said this years ago. The audience leaned forward. The light caught his Navy Cross dull gold against a dark suit. He said, "Her name is Captain Michelle Grant." The applause came in waves, rising from disbelief to thunder. I stayed seated, my pulse loud in my ears. On the front row, Eleanor lowered her head, her hands clasped too tightly. Behind her, journalists scrambled to capture every frame. Roland looked down toward me and said the words that would close a chapter I didn't know still hurt. Apologize. Now. For a heartbeat, the room froze. Then Zach stood from his seat, slow, unsteady, as if each movement cost him something. His voice was small but clear. I'm sorry. The words cracked midair, fragile and late. The crowd erupted in applause, a standing ovation that felt like rain after drought. I didn't rise immediately. I watched Roland step down from the podium, coin in hand. He approached me through the aisle as cameras flashed. When he reached me, he placed the seal coin in my palm. His fingers were trembling. He said, "You earned this the moment you flew through fire." I said, "Now it's official." The applause surged again. Eleanor still didn't look up. Her mascara had run a quiet ruin. Roland turned to the microphone one last time. He said, "Silence can't protect honor. Only truth can." Then he stepped back. The band began to play the Navy hymn, the sound rolling through the hall like the tide. I stood finally and saluted. The cameras caught the gesture, but the truth was, for no one else. It was just between us, the pilot who saved him, the man who finally said her name. After the ceremony, the reporters circled questions flying like shrapnel. How did it feel to be recognized after so long? Did you expect this? Did you forgive him? I smiled, once the kind of smile that ends conversations. Justice doesn't need interviews, I said. It just needs witnesses. Outside, the afternoon air smelled of spring rain and jet fuel. The city buzzed around us, unaware that history had just quietly shifted in one small corner of it. Roland walked beside me down the marble steps, his gait slow but steady. He said I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping quiet. I said, "You did today." He nodded, looking out toward the river. The wind caught his tie and lifted it just slightly, like something lighter was carrying him now. Behind us, Zach spoke softly, almost to himself. "I didn't know what to say," I said. "Then start by meaning it next time." He nodded, eyes red face, pale. For the first time, I believed he might. The sun dipped behind the Capitol dome, bathing the plaza in amber light. Roland extended his hand, and I took it. The handshake was brief but heavy, with years of unfinished sentences. He said, "You gave me back something I didn't think I'd ever earn again." I said, "Respect." He said, "Peace." We both smiled. Cameras flashed again, but the story they caught was simple. A family fractured by silence, finally repaired by truth. As the day faded, the band played one last song while the crowd dispersed. I stood alone for a moment at the edge of the reflecting pool. The water mirrored the sky in soft shades of gold and gray. The coin felt warm in my palm, the engraved emblem catching light one last time. I whispered to no one. "Now it's official. If you've ever waited too long for respect, hit like for her." Audacity Return, July settled over Pensacola like a held breath. The bay was flat and bright in the morning pelicans hovering as if the air itself were patient. I had just finished sorting outreach files when a knock sounded on my door. 3 quick taps followed by silence. I knew who it was before I opened it. Zach stood on the porch in a wrinkled polo and jeans, the kind of clothing that tries to look casual, and lands on defeated. He had shaved, but the effort could not erase the nights written under his eyes. He looked smaller without a camera and a crowd. He did not smile. He held a manila folder against his chest like a shield. "They will let me rebuild if you sign my rehab record," he said. I stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. He hovered near the table, glancing at the framed photos on the wall, each one a piece of a life he had spent years pretending to understand. I poured water and placed a glass in front of him. He did not touch it. He slid the folder across the table. Inside were forms for a community service placement, a letter from a nonprofit certification board, and a request for a supervising officer to validate hours served. His voice was almost steady. "The board said if I complete the program and get a senior veteran to sign off, I can apply for limited reinstatement with conditions." He paused. "I want you to sign." I looked at the blank line where a name would go and imagined ink turning into a shortcut. I asked him what he wanted me to sign for. He said, "I want a chance to start over." I asked him if he wanted forgiveness or reputation. He stared at me as if the words were in a language he had not learned. Both he said after a long beat. I kept my voice level. "Then start with none." He flinched like the sentence had weight. The clock on the wall ticked loud in the pause that followed. He said he had been working at a kitchen in Tampa, that he had shown up every day, that he had kept his head down and learned to answer to people who did not care about his smile. He said the work was hard, the kind that made your back ache and your pride quiet. He said he thought maybe that was the point. I asked how many hours he had logged. He said 240 and counted the digits like a child afraid of being wrong. I told him the number did not matter if the lesson had not written itself in his bones. He asked what the lesson was. I said honor belongs to the work, not the story. He stared at the forms again. I saw the outline of his old self flicker, the one who believed a neat signature could pack history into a line that favored him. He pushed the folder closer. "I do not know how to fix what I broke," he said. I said you begin by not asking someone else to fix it for you. He looked up and met my eyes for the first time since he arrived. The room seemed to hold its breath. He said I blamed you because it was easier than apologizing. I nodded. He said I lied because I wanted to be more than I was. I nodded again. He said I used our name and our flag to sell a version of courage I had not earned. I kept my hands flat on the table and did not look away. He swallowed hard. "I am sorry." The words came out softer than regret and heavier than habit. He reached for the glass of water, but did not drink. We sat in that quiet for what felt like a long time. Outside, clouds slid in from the Gulf, the air shifting from sun to the edge of rain. I closed the folder and handed it back. "I cannot sign this," I said. "You want me to put a seal on your beginning so the world believes it is honest. That is not how this works. The world will believe you when you have nothing to show but the way you show up." He nodded without arguing. It was new. He stood and slid the folder under his arm. He asked if there was anything he could do. I said yes. Keep working where no one sees you. Say yes when there is no camera. Tell the truth when it costs you. And when someone asks you what you learned, say the lesson without using my name. He nodded again. He turned to leave, then stopped and looked at the photo of Roland on my shelf, a younger man in a uniform that fit like a promise. "Is he angry at me?" Zach asked. I said he is angry at himself. He said, "Do you think he will forgive me?" I said, "I think he already started when he told the truth. Forgiveness grows in that soil, or it does not grow at all." He swallowed and pressed his lips together. "Thank you," he said, though he had not gotten what he came for. He walked to the door. The sky had darkened. The first heavy drops began to drum against the porch roof. He stepped out into the rain without a hood or an umbrella. He did not hurry. He tucked the folder under his shirt and walked down the path with his head bowed like he had finally learned to let weather pass through him. I watched until he turned the corner and disappeared into the gray. The house felt bigger when he was gone. I put the kettle on and set out a notebook. I wrote a single line across the top of the page. "Mercy without consequence is just repetition." The words looked clean and firm. I closed the notebook and placed it beside the stack of outreach files. The phone rang. It was Roland. His voice carried that familiar gravel, softer now, every word measured. "You did right," he said. I sat on the edge of the chair and breathed. I did not need praise. I needed accuracy. He continued before I could answer. He stood on his own feet today. "It is a start." I said a start is not a finish. He said, "I know." He asked if Zach had asked for my signature. I said he had. He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. Then he added, "Thank you for saying no." It sounded like a confession of relief. We spoke a few minutes about the program launch scheduled for November and the list of women on our waiting roster. He said he could help with logistics and transportation. I told him I would send a schedule. When we hung up, the house went quiet again. Rain deepened, drumming a steady rhythm against the eaves. The bay disappeared behind a curtain of weather. I brewed tea and stood by the window watching the line where water met sky dissolve. I thought about signatures and what they grant about how many years I had spent letting other people write the record. I thought about the word rebuild and how often it hides the real work of lifting one brick at a time with hands that have learned humility. The rain eased as quickly as it had arrived. The bay returned, silver and calm. I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled clean as if the world had been rinsed. I heard gulls arguing somewhere near the pier and an engine turning over in the distance. I held the notebook in my hand and read the line again. "Mercy without consequence is just repetition." I tore the page free and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Then I sat down and began the evening reports for the outreach. Hours served, meals delivered, rooms secured, lives steadied by paperwork that no one would ever clap for. When I finished, I closed the laptop and let the room go still. Somewhere across town, Zach was learning the shape of a day without applause. Somewhere in a small house near the shore, Roland was looking at a coin on his dresser and remembering the taste of smoke. In my own kitchen, a kettle ticked as it cooled, and the clock returned to its patient count. This was not triumph. It was alignment, and it was enough for now. September came in with the hum of late summer heat and the slow rhythm of consequence. The world had already moved on to new scandals, but for us the ripples were still widening. The federal court released its ruling that Zach Butler was barred from any public or nonprofit leadership role for 2 years. The sentence was not jail, but it was confinement of a different kind. His probation required full-time community labor at Veterans Kitchen in Tampa, a program that served hot meals to homeless vets and trained them for civilian employment. The news barely made the papers. The city had already spent its outrage. He called once to tell me where he was assigned. I could hear the sound of clattering pans and shouted orders behind him. He said they put me on dish rotation. I said, then wash well. He laughed, once short and bitter, then hung up. The next day, the outreach office received an email confirming that the Federal Review had cleared our new funding. The note was brief, almost impersonal, but it meant survival. The program was reborn under a new name, Valor Path Initiative. It would focus on female veterans transitioning into logistics and management. When I returned to the office after the announcement, a small crowd of volunteers clapped quietly. On the far wall, the board chair had hung a framed photo from the conference in Washington, the one where Roland had said her name is Captain Michelle Grant. Beneath it, a brass plate read, Revenant One. I stood there a moment too long, staring at the image of myself in uniform under harsh, stage light. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like a ledger closing. That afternoon, I received a letter. No envelope markings, just my name in handwriting I recognized from holiday cards years ago. Eleanor. I opened it slowly. Inside, 3 pages of blue ink, the kind written when someone has rehearsed humility. She said she had watched the hearing, watched the conference, and watched Roland walk across the stage without looking back. She wrote, I mistook silence for love. I thought protecting our image was protecting our family. I see now it was vanity wearing devotion's clothes. She ended with, I do not expect a reply, only that you know I finally understand. I folded the pages once and placed them in the drawer beside the D-class orders from Operation Revenant. I did not answer. Some ghosts stay useful when they are left alone. That night, I visited Roland's new classroom at the community center near the base. The sign outside read, Integrity in Command. He had retired from guest lecturing at the academy and started teaching leadership seminars for transitioning officers. I stood by the door as he wrapped up a session. His voice carried calm authority. He was explaining how command without accountability corrodes from within. When he saw me, he smiled and waved the group off. The room emptied, leaving only us and the scent of chalk dust and coffee. He said, I never thought I'd see the day I teach honesty as a skill. I said, You're the right one to do it. He chuckled, shaking his head. He said, You think he'll be all right down there in Tampa. I said, I think he's learning what duty really tastes like. He nodded, his eyes soft. You did more for him by saying no than I ever did by saying yes. We talked for a while about the new outreach fund, about volunteers, about the names that would soon fill the program's first roster. He said he wanted to donate the seal coin for display in the main hall. I said, keep it. It's part of your story, too. He said, maybe, but I want them to know what truth costs. When I left, the evening air smelled of rain again. The seasons had turned full circle, though nothing felt like ending. Back at the outreach, the photo wall had grown. Pictures of women graduating from certification programs, smiling in civilian suits, their eyes still carrying the alertness of soldiers. Each frame was another form of quiet revenge, the kind that doesn't humiliate, only corrects. I sat at my desk and turned off the lights. The bay glowed faintly through the window, a long reflection of street lamps and moonlight. I opened my notebook and wrote a new entry. Consequence is not punishment, it is clarity. I thought about Zach scrubbing pots under fluorescent light, about Eleanor sitting in her quiet house, with the letter she wished she'd written years earlier, about Roland standing before a class of officers, teaching them the one thing he had learned, too late. I closed the notebook. The clock on the wall ticked into the next hour. Tomorrow there would be forms to sign, training modules to approve lives, to adjust stories to listen to. It would all look like paperwork to someone passing by, but I knew better now. Paper held weight. Paper could end silence. Paper could rewrite what people believed about who served and who stayed quiet. I walked to the photo wall one more time and touched the small brass plaque under my name, Revenant One. The title no longer felt heavy, it felt earned. Have you ever learned that consequences can heal more than apologies? Leave a comment if you know that kind of peace. November in Florida carried the kind of air that pretended to be winter. The mornings came cool enough for breath to show, but by noon sunlight returned like an old friend who still knocked before entering. The outreach building smelled of fresh paint and coffee. Rows of folding chairs faced a modest wooden podium. A new banner stretched across the wall, Women Who Served. The letters were simple navy blue on white, unadorned and firm. I stood near the back of the room watching volunteers place pamphlets on every seat. Each pamphlet carried a line on the cover that had taken me a week to choose. Every file holds a life. It sounded bureaucratic at first glance, but for anyone who had lived long enough inside systems that called emotion unprofessional, it meant survival. The grant had come through faster than I expected. The state fund and 2 private donors had backed the program after the conference speech in Washington. We had converted one of the old Veterans Outreach offices into a training and counseling center for women who had survived command abuse and psychological manipulation inside the service. Gaslighting was a word whispered before. Now it was written on the door. I adjusted the microphone stand and glanced at the first row. Roland sat there in a navy blazer, his silver hair combed neatly, eyes steady. On his lap, the seal coin glinted like something retrieved from deep water. He'd come to speak last, but he had insisted on arriving early to help set up chairs. Zach was by the refreshment table arranging trays of sandwiches and bottled water. His movements were careful, quiet, almost ceremonial. He caught my glance, once nodded, and returned to stacking napkins. His posture had changed. The arrogance that once filled every gesture was gone. In its place, there was something close to awareness. The room filled quickly. Women of different ages arrived, some in civilian suits, some still wearing service jackets that carried stories in their seams. The air hummed with cautious hope. At exactly 10, I stepped to the podium. "Good morning. Thank you for coming." The words felt small compared to the weight in the room. I looked around and saw faces that had waited years for acknowledgement, not applause. We built this space because silence has served enough. We are here to rebuild with truth, not noise. The program's mission was practical career placement counseling, peer advocacy, but its heart was invisible. It was about giving language to what had been dismissed as confusion or hysteria. As I spoke, I saw Zach pause his work and lean slightly toward the sound. He was listening, not intruding, just absorbing. I told the room about the files we would keep, about how each form and testimony would be treated as sacred record. I said, every file holds a life. There was a murmur of agreement, a wave of soft nods. After the speech, I invited Roland to the stage. He rose slowly, shoulders squared. The applause began before he reached the microphone. He waited for it to settle, then said, "I used to believe command was about perfection. Then I learned it is about correction." He looked at me. "Today, I am here not to command, but to witness." He took the seal coin from his pocket, the same one he had once kept hidden after the Washington conference. He held it up between 2 fingers. This coin was minted for operational courage. I am giving it to the woman who taught me that moral courage takes more. He stepped forward, placed the coin in my hand, and closed my fingers around it. "You lead now, Captain." The title landed softly like something that had been earned twice. The room rose in applause again, not the loud kind, but the kind that carries warmth. I met his gaze and nodded once. "Thank you," I said. But he only smiled. When the ceremony ended, people lingered. Conversations unfolded in corners, laughter returning to voices that had forgotten its sound. Zach moved through the room, collecting plates and cups, asking if anyone needed help carrying things to cars. He never looked for acknowledgement, but I caught him. Pause at the photo wall, studying the image labeled Revenant One. His reflection overlapped with mine in the glass. For a second, the 2 stories looked almost reconciled. As the last guests left, I stayed behind to tidy the chairs. Zach approached holding a folded towel. He said, "You filled the room without filling the silence." I smiled. "Silence isn't weakness," I said. "It's choice." He nodded slowly, repeating the phrase under his breath, as if testing its weight. He said the kitchen had approved his transfer to logistics, that he'd be coordinating food shipments for shelters across the state. He said it wasn't leadership, but it was steady work. I told him steady work builds everything else. He said, "I don't know if I'll ever deserve forgiveness." I said, "Forgiveness isn't a medal, it's a maintenance schedule." He laughed, not out of humor, but recognition. Then he said, "You know Mom's letter, she meant it." I said, "I know." He said, "You never wrote back." I said, "Some words stay truer in silence." He nodded and placed the towel on the table. Before he left, he looked at the framed motto again. "Every file holds a life." He said, "I used to think paperwork killed meaning. Now I think it protects it." I said, "That's why we keep records." He nodded once more, then walked toward the exit shoulders, squared the posture of someone finally carrying his own story. Roland came up beside me a moment later, hands in his pockets. He said, "He's coming around." I said, "He's walking the right direction." We stood there for a while, watching sunlight slide across the polished floor. The room felt peaceful, unfinished, in a good way. I thought of the years behind us, of the lies unthreaded, of the patience that had turned into structure. I ran my thumb over the coin's edge. It was warm from my skin. The engraving caught the light, valor through truth. Outside, volunteers were loading supplies into a van marked Veterans Relief Network. I stepped out into the parking lot and watched them pull away. The air smelled of salt and asphalt and beginning. I took one last look at the building, at the banner that would stay for others to see. Women who served. The letters rippled slightly in the breeze, but held steady. Inside, Zach's folded towel rested on the table beside the framed motto, "Every file holds a life." For the first time in years, that sentence felt not like a burden, but a promise. Quiet victories, I realized, are not silent. They just echo longer. Dawn over Pensacola Bay was the color of brushed steel, a soft gray that hinted at light but held its breath before committing. The water was calm, folding itself into small ribbons that touched the sand and retreated like a slow heartbeat. I walked the shoreline barefoot, my shoes hooked through one hand, the seal coin in the other. It was heavier than it looked, smooth along the rim, where years of handling had worn it down. The engraving had dulled, except where sunlight caught the words, "Valor through truth." Each wave seemed to echo that rhythm. I had not planned to be out this early, but sleep had thinned to a kind of waking drift. The air smelled of salt and the faint sweetness of pine from the dunes. The world was quiet enough to hear my own footsteps and the distant hum of a boat engine beyond the pier. I thought of how many years had begun like this, the ocean still patient, the sky undecided, the past refusing to vanish, but softening its edges. Ahead, a small cafe near the boardwalk was just opening, its porch light flickering to life. The sign read, "Veterans Brew." A man in a gray apron rolled up the shuttered window and began setting out chairs. I recognized the shape of his shoulders before the light found his face. Zach. He had cut his hair short and grown a faint beard, the kind that no longer tried to disguise youth or regret. When he noticed me, he hesitated, then lifted a hand in greeting. "Morning," he called, his voice carrying easily over the sand. I nodded and walked closer. He leaned against the railing, a mug of coffee steaming in one hand. Still pushing paper, he asked, the old teasing tone softened into something almost kind. I smiled, only the kind that rewrites history. He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "Guess you're still winning," he said. I said, "It's not about winning. It's about finishing the right story." He looked down at the cup and said, "I read about your new program in the papers, the one for women vets. Sounds like real work." I said, "It is." He said, "I'm running supply inventory for the cafe now. We donate leftovers to the shelters every night. It's not glamorous, but it's honest. I told him that was the only kind of work that lasts. He nodded, then gestured toward the coin in my hand. You still carry that thing? I turned it so the rising light brushed across its face. Habit, I said. He smiled. Dad says he's planning a trip to see you next month. I said, tell him to bring his lecture notes. He laughed again, softer this time, and said, he says you were always the better teacher. I looked out at the water. Maybe I said. Or maybe I just stayed longer after class. A gull cut across the horizon, its cry sharp and brief. The tide crept closer, touching the edge of my footprints before erasing them. Zach watched the horizon too. He said, you ever think about leaving here? I said no. I already did once. This time I'm staying where the record fits the truth. He nodded, and for a moment we both listened to the sound of waves folding over themselves, each one quieter than the last. Behind us, a car door shut. I turned and saw Roland walking down the boardwalk, hands in pockets, jacket collar up against the breeze. His gait was slower now, but steady. When he reached the cafe steps, he raised his hand in a small salute. I lifted mine in return. He smiled but did not approach, just stood there a while watching us like a man content to let peace remain undisturbed. Zach glanced back and said, he still checks up on me. I said, that's what fathers do when they've learned how. He said, he talks about you a lot. I said, then he's healing. The sun finally cleared the horizon, spilling gold across the bay. The light hit the coin in my hand, and for a brief second, it flashed bright enough to catch both their eyes. I turned it between my fingers, feeling the warmth spread. I thought of Yemen, of the nights spent listening to calm static, of the years spent filing reports that no one read until they mattered. I thought of silence and how it used to feel like punishment, and how now it felt like control. Zach sipped his coffee and said, you ever going to let that coin go? I said. Maybe one day, he said. When I said when. Respect doesn't need a reminder. He nodded as if understanding something larger than the words. The cafe bell rang as the first customers arrived, a group of older veterans in caps and worn jackets. Zach waved to them, then turned back to me. You want coffee? He asked. I said, maybe later. He said, you'll be here tomorrow. I said, I'm always here. He smiled once more, the kind that reaches the eyes, then disappeared inside to start the morning shift. I stood there watching him move between tables, greeting people with ease. The same boy who once needed a crowd now found peace in serving them. The same man who once faked valor now practiced it quietly. Roland had started walking again, slow and deliberate, his path angling toward the pier. I watched him lift a hand in farewell before turning into the light. For a moment, the three of us existed on different lines of the same horizon, past, present, and something that finally resembled future. I looked down at the coin one last time. It caught the sun just right, throwing a line of gold across the wet sand. I knelt, pressed it into the earth, and let a wave roll over it. The metal glimmered once and vanished beneath the foam. I whispered to the water, respect isn't given, it's built. The tide answered by pulling everything smooth again. I stood, brushed the sand from my hands, and watched the morning unfold. The world felt lighter, not empty but balanced. The cafe behind me buzzed with low laughter. The bay stretched wide and calm, carrying no echo of war, no sound of accusation, only the steady rhythm of work continuing. I turned toward the boardwalk and began walking back the sea behind me, whispering its own quiet verdict. Justice isn't loud, it's steady. Subscribe if you believe that.